Thursday, February 23rd, 2011. Dinner and Learn, God of Our Understanding, Part 13.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Judaism and Recovery. Tonight we're studying from the book God of Our Understanding, Jewish Spirituality and Recovery from Addiction by Rabbi Shais Taub. And we are on the last chapter of this section, the section about theological study of the 12 steps. And it's chapter 10 and it's called Will. We talked about the fact that God is the power, that God is goodness, that God has forbearance where He forgives us for any problems and for any things that we did wrong. And now we're going to talk about the fact that God has a will and what the will is. Of all the 12 steps, the 11th speaks most directly about our relationship with God and how that connection is maintained. The step reads, sought through prayer and meditation, not to be confused with medication, to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. So we're going to have a conscious contact with God, and the way we do that is through prayer, and the prayer is for us to know what His will for us is. So He has a will, and He has a will for us. And He also grants us the power to carry that will. More than just telling us how to seek God, these steps inform our concept of God like no other. Because the very fact that that's how we seek God tells us something about the God. At first reading it may be easy to miss, but with a little bit of thought we can see that 11th step makes what is perhaps the most significant statement about God to be found in all of the steps. There's an immensely important word in the steps. This word is will. So, if we understand the step properly, we understand that God has a will. This is an incredibly important point. Step 3, which speaks of God's caring, as well as steps 5, 6, and 7, which allude to His desire for a relationship with us, both imply that God has a will. It's an implication. He wants to care for us. He wants to have a relationship with us. Indeed, even more than He wants us to behave perfect, which is a very important part that we discussed last week. To God, it's very important to be in a relationship with us. More than He wants us to behave, He wants us to be in a relationship. That's why when we mess up, for the sake of the relationship, He's willing to overlook any of our mistakes. But here in step 11, God's will is explicitly mentioned for the first time. And not only does He have a will, He has also a specific will for us. God wants something from the individual. Many philosophical and religious systems view the idea of God's wanting something as problematic. How can an infinite and perfect being want or be in want of anything? Does this not imply a lacking of something or someone? Which means basically, when I want something is because I don't have it. Now if God is perfect and God is infinite, there is nothing that God is missing. So by saying that God wants us to do something, many people do not accept the idea that God has a want for us because that would make God imperfect. But Judaism, however, is not at all troubled by this concept. Indeed, the very foundation of Judaism as a covenantal religion, which means a religion that's based on the covenant between God and people, is that God most certainly does want something from us. A covenant has two sides to it. Two people agree together to be in a relationship and that they would take certain actions in this relationship. Each one will take care of their side. God promised to uphold His end of the deal, but He asked for certain things in return. As God told Abraham, father of the Jewish people, at the first covenant, I will establish my covenant that is an everlasting covenant. As for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you for the generations to come. And God gives him the mitzvah of circumcision as part of the covenant. That's why the word for a circumcision is wrongly called a bris, because bris does not mean circumcision. Mila means circumcision. Brit, means a covenant. So the bris means covenant. It's the specific covenant of the circumcision, but it's still the covenant. So the bris is the first covenant. There's a few other covenants. There's 13 covenants total in the Torah. And the covenant here, the other one that comes just prior to the revelation at Mount Sinai when God gave the Jewish people the Torah, He said to them, now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Which is why we are called the chosen nation. Chosen to what? Chosen to be in a covenant with God. God is clearly asking for something. This particular aspect of His will that He wants, what He wants and does not want, are the very basis of Torah law. Now, besides the Torah being a very spiritual document, it has 613 laws. Okay? It's a book that enumerates laws that say what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and what to do in situations of conflict between men and another man, etc. It has really laws pertaining to every single area of life of a man, of a person, of a businessman, of a parent. Any situation that can ever come up in any lifestyle comes up in the Torah, and the Torah is an opinion of what needs to be done. So it's a set of laws that basically tell us what to do. But, according to Kabbalistic teachings, it's not just that. It's not just that God gave us rules of how to behave. God also expressed His will to us. It's different. The commandments are not technical rules, but an expression of God's desire. Indeed, as the Kabbalists describe it, God made Himself vulnerable, so to speak, by articulating His likes and dislikes, and allowing His creations free choice of whether or not to abide by these wishes. Which means God did not only, it was not only for our sake, so we know how to behave in society, so we know how to act religiously, but it was God's will. That's what He wants. The reason these are the rules are not because these rules make sense in our world today or because they resolve conflict in the best way possible, which may be. But more than all of that, those commandments are a look inside the will of God. Many of us have trouble talking about our needs in our relationships. We like to be discovered. We like people to guess, to love us so much that they will know what we want. We want our children to know what we want. We want our spouses and our lovers and our parents to know what we want, etc. Why can't we just say it? Why can't we just say it? Why can't we ask something from another person directly when we want it? Because then they might say no. And that might be hurtful. So, to announce my will and subjecting myself to the other person's desire to fulfill my will or not fulfilling my will is sort of making myself vulnerable. When I reveal my will to a person who's not compelled necessarily to fulfill my will, then I may be vulnerable to the other person's decision of what they're going to do. So when God came at Mount Sinai and said, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, He said, and here is what I want from you. And you can choose to do it or choose not to do it. As such, this is how God makes Himself available for intimacy with His creations. As such, Judaism does not view adherence to God's commandments so much as a matter of obedience, as a matter of sensitivity to God's desire. Offender number one. So, this is very, very important over here. Because in the relationship, we can look at the parental relationship. How do we get kids to listen to parents? Parents wish that the kids follow their directions. Be obedient. Some people choose to make it hurt when they don't. Certain people coerce them. Certain people bribe them. But really, the most compelling argument for me to do something for another person is that they care for me and I care for them. So my behavior, the most influential part on what my behavior will be, is the nature of my relationship, the quality of my relationship. So therefore, the more I follow willingly the wants and the will of my parents, it shows on the quality of our relationship. If I do it just because they're withholding stuff from me, it does not reflect the quality of my relationship. If I do it because they punish me, then it does not reflect. But when I do it willingly and happily, then yes, my obedience to my parents reflects the nature of our relationship. So God is giving us an opportunity to show that we love Him. He's giving us a way to express our desire to be in the relationship. We have no other way of achieving that. Because God is infinite, and we're finite human beings. And the only way we can actually relate to each other is if we follow precisely and exactly God's wants for us. It's not about how we feel. It's not about how it makes us spiritual. It's an action-based relationship that the bottom line of this relationship is, now that you know what He wants, and now that He asks you to do it, by doing it, you are in a relationship. The most common example brought in the teaching of Chassidus for that is a very simple person with very limited intellectual capacities that is in the presence of a very smart intellectual person. So we're going to imagine this is Princeton, and it's the 1920s, and Albert Einstein is sitting in his room, and he's writing the theory of relativity. And there's a janitor in the room, and the janitor knows how awesome Albert Einstein is, and he wants to connect with him. He wants to have a relationship, but he's just a janitor. And he has very limited intellectual capacities. So technically, he has no way to connect with him. But what if Albert Einstein tells him, "Can you please wipe up the window for me?" Then the moment that he knows now that that's Albert Einstein's will and want, now it could be that it has a direct effect on how he's writing his law of relativity, or it doesn't have. But he asked him to wash the window, then at this point these two people connect on the level of, this is my want and my will, and he fulfills it. So the same goes with a relationship between a finite human being and an infinite God. We want to connect together. I can't do it on my terms. If the simple man decided that his way to connect to Albert Einstein is to bring it here in the room, it means nothing. It might be even bothering him. So whatever terms this person comes up with cannot measure up to this person. Let's say he wants to help him write the theory of relativity. He's submitting his ideas. What are you talking about? So on an intellectual level it doesn't work. The only thing that actually works is on an action level if the professor specifically says, this is my will, and the janitor fulfills the will. So us as human beings, we have no way to connect to infinite creation. None. Oh, it feels awesome to burn some incenses and say some la-la stuff. Well, go for it. But you know what? You're not connecting with God. Unless God says, I want you to burn incenses and say la la la. So if we know that that's God's will for us, then by doing we're connecting. Now, great thought can come to us during that time that we're meditating. And we can decide during that time to save the world and fix the world and all these beautiful things. But we're not connecting with God because God hasn't expressed His will for us to do that. But for example, if I eat a piece of matzah on Pesach, on the night of Pesach, and if it tastes good, it doesn't taste good, it gives me a stomach ache, it doesn't give me a stomach ache, it doesn't matter because this is specifically what God said in the Torah. On the 15th of the month of Nisan, you should eat a piece of matzah. So when I eat a piece of matzah, I'm fulfilling His will. I am in a relationship with God. Which is why the word in Hebrew for the commandments, the 613 commandments, is mitzvah. And a lot of people say, oh yeah, he did a mitzvah, that's so beautiful, which is a good deed. But really, the word in Hebrew mitzvah connotes a connector. That's what it means, a connector. The Zohar says, tzavta v'chibur, to be connected. So there's 613 connectors. That we have access to a relationship with God when we do one of them, any of them, some of them, all of them. Everything else is my will, not God's will. And therefore, it's going nowhere as far as the relationship with God is going. Okay. I kind of skipped around a little bit. I'm going to continue reading and then we'll skip when we get to what we talked already. That is not to say that without our compliance God is somehow incomplete. God requires nothing. He has no needs, but He does have a will to be in a relationship with us. In fact, this will is no less than the driving force behind all of creation. And like we said last week, that God created the world because He wanted to be in a relationship with us. And it's not that He needed it, it's just a desire. It's a want. What's the difference between a need and a want? So we'll go into the paragraph on page 81. For example, let's say your spouse say that they need something. It is possible to ask them to explain their need. If they cannot, you might even be able to argue that they don't really need it, because there's no compelling argument for it. However, if your spouse say that they want something, even if they cannot convincingly explain why, it doesn't mean that they don't really want it. That's the definition of a want as opposed to a need. A need is practical. A desire is impractical. Thus, the appropriate response to a desire is either to fulfill it or not fulfill it, but not to argue with it. So too, when we speak of God's will, we mean His irrational, impractical desire. The very impracticality of God's relation with us is what makes it intimate as opposed to utilitarian. If God had needed us to do something for Him, and we fulfilled it, then it's like the plumber came by. The sink needed to be fixed. He fixed the sink, and now the sink is working. Thank you very much. I'll even tip him. But that's a utilitarian relationship. I need a plumber to fix my sink So a plumber that fixes my sink fulfills my need. A woman who wants someone to bring her flowers, if the plumber came with flowers, does not fulfill her need. It's the wrong guy. It's the wrong guy. So it's not when we fulfill someone's need, it's utilitarian. When we fulfill someone's desire, it becomes intimate. God doesn't need us. He wants us. Just like Uncle Sam. I was once, okay, so this we can skip. And we're going to page 82. We talked about that too. And, He wants us. God wants us. So now we're going to go to the bottom of page 83. I kind of summarized what we have here on page 82. I'm just going to read the last little paragraph before that. By having a will for us, God lets us be connected to Him. He invites us to become an extension of His will. In so doing, He gives us a gift. He allows us to be of significance, just like Albert Einstein allows the janitor to be of significance. He tells us that we matter to Him in the most profound way, because He doesn't need us, but He wants us. Okay. Now, how does this have anything to do with recovery? So God has a will, and when we have a will, we connect with God, and all that stuff is beautiful. How does it help an addict recover from his addiction? So as we already mentioned many times, albeit in a variety of words, the addict's basic problem is an obsession with self. In order to live happily and usefully, the addict needs a way to transcend his or her own ego. But how does one get outside of oneself? How do we truly get outside of ourselves? Because many times we get a little outside of ourselves. But hey, anytime we interact with any person or any object in this world, it's somehow connected to us again. Because it serves some types of purpose for me, eventually, on any level. As a human being, I cannot really be outside of myself completely unless the only way to do that is to connect with God. Our answer is that one transcends self by connecting to the infinite. That's the true out-of-self experience. But this then begs the question, exactly how does one connect to the infinite? How does the janitor have a relationship with Albert? As I've just explained, one connects to the fulfillment of a will. Not the exertion of self-will, but the surrender of it in deference to the will of God. So I have a will. I'm not stupid. I'm not brainwashed. I'm an intellectual, smart person who has a will. Yet, for the sake of my relationship with God, I let go of my will and I do God's will. We'll see that I don't just do it, I happily do it. Many NA meetings close with that fellowship's third step prayer. Take my will and my life, guide me in recovery, show me how to live. In other words, the steps talk about a God who has a specific will for us, a God who asks us for things, who allows himself to be served, because a God who wants nothing, who has no opinion or preference, cannot be served. And without the opportunity to serve, one cannot transcend the self, and one cannot recover. In the original draft of the Big Book submitted to the early members of the fellowship for review, the third step read, made a decision to turn our will and lives over to the care and direction of God. After some debate, the word direction was deleted because it was considered overbearing. The basic idea, however, has remained a cornerstone of the program. A working concept of God as outlined in the 12 step program includes the idea that God gives us direction. As many in recovery are wont to say, God is an acronym for good, orderly direction. It's interesting to consider. The Zohar says, God and the Torah are entirely one. The Torah is what God revealed to us at Mount Sinai. He opened up a window to His will. And that is the Torah. So the Torah is God's will. And the word Torah in Hebrew comes from the word hora'ah, direction or instruction. Therefore, essentially, direction from God is another way of referring to God. When we have God's instruction in life, we have God in our life. This is God. This is the only way we have God. There's no other way to grab God. That's what the Zohar says. There is no way to have God besides through His will. So the will of God becomes God, because there's nothing else I'm getting besides God's will. As noted above in reference to step 2, the problem of the addict is primarily an obsession of control. This is why it's so important to see God as a power greater than ourselves, so that we'll feel free to actually surrender control. Because I want to give up control to someone who has the capacity to positively control my life, not to some dictator that's going to kill me. However, in order to address fully the issue of control, it must be recognized that the addict's desire for control is just that, a desire. In other words, the addict has a will. He or she wants to be in control. Recovery means realizing that God also has a will and then deciding to place that will before one's own. Describing the 11th step call for regular prayer and meditation, the Big Book says, we usually conclude the period of meditation with a prayer that we be shown all through the day what our next step is to be. We ask especially for freedom from self-will, which is what we conclude our meeting here every Thursday night, the Jewish Recovery meeting, with this prayer, with a little different translation, maybe you will, or God and God our fathers, to accustom us to following your instructions, to adhere to the fulfillment of your commandments. Let not our evil inclination have mastery over us, rather force our inclination to be subservient to you. Which means that my evil inclination wants me to be expressing my self-will. And my good inclination wants me to express God's will for me. And I pray to God to give me the energy to allow me to pick His will over my will. God has a will. Each of us has a will. Being connected to God is about making ourselves more concerned with what He wants than what we want. As the Mishnah in Ethics of Our Fathers says, make His will your own will. Now this is different. It doesn't say, don't have a will. It doesn't say, do God's will. It says, make His will be your will. What does that mean? The Lubavitcher Rebbe explained this teaching to mean that although the strict letter of the law requires us to fulfill God's will, whether we like it or not, the sages encourage us to go beyond mere observance of the law and actually remake our will to be aligned to God's. Fulfilling God's will should not be a burden, but a manifestation of our truest self, which really exists. Maimonides discusses this in the case of divorce. The Jewish divorce, the get, requires that the man willingly gives the get to his wife. Now, if a husband withholds the get from his wife for selfish reasons, the Talmud says we coerce him until he says, I want. We beat the crap out of him. Until he says, I want to give her the get. Maybe not physically, maybe emotionally, I don't know. But the bottom line is that the law requires him to want. So we beat him up till he says, I want. Now when Monday asks a simple question, that's fraud. For sure he says, I want. He doesn't want. He doesn't want to get beaten. But he doesn't want to give the divorce. That's the problem. So how is this is a joke. So my money says, no, you don't get it. The part of him that says, I don't want to give the get, is his outer self. the one that is selfish, the one that's not connected to God. But his inner self, his true self, is one with God. So his true self always wants to do God's will. And God's will for him is he should give the get. So once we coerce him, we're breaking out his outer layer, we're revealing his inner layer. That's all we do. And once we reveal his inner layer, he says, I want. For sure he wants. That's God's will. So really, it's not that complicated. If we had two separate wills, I have my will, and God has his will, and we're in contradiction to each other, and I need to move my will out of the way and put God's will in there, I might be resentful. But we're not asked to do that. We're asked to dig deeper inside of us, to find the part of us that is aligned with God's will, and be willing to act upon it. And therefore, when we do God's will, we're happy to do it, because this is who we truly are. When a person can undergo such a change, sometimes something incredible begins to happen. And my friends, it is a big change. As the Mishnah continues, and he will then fulfill your will as if it were his will, God will lead the person into the circumstances most conducive to expressing his desire to do God's will. Most old-timers in recovery will attest to the fact that when one lives to do God's will, not only does one attitude improve, but somehow, somewhat inexplicably, life actually gets better as well. I have heard the sentiment expressed succinctly many times with many people in recovery. I tried my way doesn't work. I tried his way works. The phrase, thy will be done, is found 3 times in the Big Book. The wording is obviously a direct reference to the Lord's Prayer of the Christian liturgy, but as an interesting emendation is made to these words on page 85, where it states in relation to the 11th step, every day is a day when we must carry the vision of God's will into all of our activities. How can I best serve thee? Thy will, parentheses, not mine, end of parentheses, be done. The concept of the phrase and the notable insertion of the words not mine in parentheses put quite a new spin on these words, not to be found in the original. Here, thy will be done is used as a request to God that in all areas of life his will shall overrule our own. Please disregard what I say, because I'm crazy. You know what's good for me. So whenever I kick and scream, ignore that. Whenever I make plans, erase them. Just do your plan, because my plan leads me to insanity, and your plan restores me to sanity. In other words, the program is describing a God who has an opinion about all of our activities, whether we eat, sleep, do business, or pray. There is a way to do it that conforms to God's will. As King Solomon said, in all your ways you should know him, and he will make your path straight. Or in the words of the Mishnah, all your deeds should be for the sake of heaven. And you can look out to talk about, the assumption that God has a will for us, and how does God bring his will to us. I would like to go in the top of page 87. The way that God gives his will to us, this does not have to come in the form of prophecy or a booming voice from the clouds. God's will can be revealed to us in a number of ways that are perfectly natural and normal. As the Baal Shem Tov taught, everything a person sees or hears can be taken as a lesson in serving the Creator. In the words of the Big Book, God will constantly disclose more to you and to us. The answers will come if your own house is in order. So if I am utilizing my eyes the right way and my ears the right way, I may hear and see God's will for me throughout my day. If I am blind or I am deaf, then yes, the message can be screaming at me and flashing in front of me, and I will not hear it and I will not see it. So when my house is in order, when my eyes are seeing, when my ears are hearing, then throughout the day they are open to God's message, to God's will for me, then that will is revealed to me. By deferring his or her personal will, the recovering addict inevitably finds a new way of living that is infinitely more fulfilling than a life of active addiction. Yet, there are still those who are uncomfortable with the notion of such complete surrender. They think it's a prescription for passivity. The Jewish view, however, is that submission to God's will is the key to effective living. With self-will, one is limited to drawing upon one's own finite ability and wherewithal. Eventually, one is bound to confront an obstacle or an impasse that cannot be negotiated or overcome. By doing things God's way rather than our own, we channel the force of the Creator, and nothing can stop the force of the Creator in His creation. So do I want to add a turbo to my engine, or do I want to drive a little electric car? And that's the question. So if I am doing my will, I am driving a golf cart. And when I'm doing God's will, I'm driving a Ferrari. Thus, we return to our first concept of God that we gleaned from the steps. That He is the power. Giving up on self-will in order to do God's will is not passivity. It does not mean that one has no will. It means that one's will now comes from a higher place than his or her own needs and wants. Indeed, Judaism sees as the ultimate level of human existence. For this reason, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are lauded as being chariots of divine will. What is a chariot? Back in the days, today our chariots have motors. Back in the days, the motor was the horse and the chariot was in the back. So the chariot had no way of going anywhere without the horse. Right? So when someone was described as a chariot, it means that he was not the one powering the motion of his own vehicle. Someone else was. Well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, the Torah says that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were only a chariot. Does that mean that they sat all day and did nothing? No. They chose to connect to the horsepower of God rather than their own head and their own will and their own actions. So therefore, their carriage went much further than it would go if they would be moving it. Meaning that they lived their entire lives in a state of complete surrender to God. As Chassidus teaches, even the average person attains the same quality of self-nullity whenever he or she fulfills any of the commandments. When I do God's will because it's God's will, I'm unhooking myself from the carriage and I'm hooking it up to God's powerful engine. One actually becomes a conduit at the moment to channel the divine. In other words, whenever one submits to the will of God, one automatically receives the power to carry that out, because now we're connected to the power. We give God our will, and God gives us His power.